All right, we're going to get started. Thank you all for coming to the Harvard Federal Society's final speakers event of the fall semester. I want to thank Leon Johnson, our Vice President for Speakers, for having put on a wonderful speakers program this semester. I'm Joel Alisea. I'm the president of the Harvard Federal Society. We stand for three principles: that the state exists to preserve freedom, that the separation of powers is central to our Constitution, and that it's emphatically the province and duty of the Judicial Department to say what the law is and not what it should be. We're a group of moderate, conservative, and libertarian law students, and one of those students, Leon Johnson, our Vice President for Speakers, will now introduce our principal guest.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. Dean Martha Minow is the Jeremiah Smith Jr. Professor of Law and the Dean of Harvard Law School. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Michigan, a master's degree in education from Harvard, and her Juris Doctor from Yale Law School, where she was an editor of the Yale Law Journal. After graduating from law school, Dean Minow clerked for Judge David Bazelon of the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and then for Justice Thurgood Marshall of the United States Supreme Court. She is an expert in human rights and advocacy for members of racial and religious minorities and for women, children, and persons of disabilities. She is a very strong advocate in the field of education as well, including a 5-year partnership with the Federal Department of Education where she worked to increase access to the curriculum for students with disabilities. Among her many books, Just Schools Pursuing Equality in Societies of Difference and In Brown's Wake, Legacies of America's Educational Landmark are especially apt for this event, and we're very grateful for her for taking part. Governor Mitch Daniels is the 49th governor of the state of Indiana and the author of the current best-selling book, Keeping the Republic, Saving America by Trusting Americans. He earned a bachelor's degree from Princeton and a Juris Doctor from Georgetown. As governor, he led Indiana to its first balanced budget in 8 years and transformed a $700 million deficit into an annual surplus of $370 million. He also presided over record-breaking investment and job growth and earned Indiana, which now ranks near the top in every national ranking of business attractiveness, its first ever AAA credit rating. His other accomplishments include the lease of the Indiana Toll Road, the largest privatization of public infrastructure in the United States to date, the creation of the Healthy Indiana Plan to provide health care coverage for uninsured Hoosier adults, and a sweeping property tax reform in 2008 that resulted in the biggest tax cut in Indiana history, and as well as the most expansive education reforms in the country in 2011. And we're very grateful for Governor Mitch Daniels to come here and speak to us today.
Many thanks, Leon, and to all of you, and of course to the Society for this invitation. There was a specific homework assignment, which I will attempt to be faithful to, and that will be to talk with you about one matter in specific, which is a choice, and one corner of that education reform that Leon just mentioned. But I'll endeavor to name my tune in a responsibly brief time so that we have plenty of time for your questions and for the deans. I read once, maybe it's apocryphal, but I read that on his way to what he expected to be the commencement of his law school studies, Martin Luther was struck by lightning and changed his mind on the spot, which I have described to other audiences as a double blessing because the world got a great theologian and one less lawyer. And but in a later blessing, much more modest, the world got one less lawyer. I make no pretense to have been one, to really be one, although I did stagger through law school at night and have not practiced the profession since. But you know, by the way, here's a little tip. You learn a lot of things in a job like mine if you do them the way I do. I travel the state all the time and try to make a point of finding people at every station of life. And in my part of the country, there are a lot of people who still revere the memory of Elvis Presley, to the point where many of them dress like him, sing like him, have competitions to see who can be the most like him. This is very important. I can help you avoid a faux pas, perhaps, in the future. Never call them an Elvis impersonator. This is to give instant offense. They're an Elvis tribute artist. So there's no charge for that, but this will come in handy one day. I, on the other hand, when I discuss legal matters, could be considered an impersonator. But let me speak a little bit to the assigned topic without going further than my qualifications might justify. In 2011, in Indiana, we enacted what outside observers have often described as probably the most far-reaching set of education reforms any state has attempted to date. And none of the ideas were particularly original, but we did go further, and on a variety of fronts. Teacher quality and teacher evaluation now will have first reference to how the students are doing. Teachers will no longer be penalized merely for the lack of seniority. In fact, that is expressly prohibited in contracts in the state now by another reform that was part of the package. And then in a variety of ways, we expanded the choice of Indiana citizens about the schools that their children would attend. This was really not the first step we had taken. In 2008, as a consequence of the property tax reform, actually, that Leon mentioned, we had established that henceforth families could choose any public school without being charged tuition. Previously, if you tried to send your child across into the next district, they would charge you, and frequently more than a family could afford. So we lowered that barrier in 2008. In 2011, we took the lid off, various lids off charter schools, liberated them from some really discriminatory laws that we had had before, made it possible for more of them to come into existence. And then, maybe most notably, we enacted the nation's first universal, means-tested, but universal scholarship program, often referred to as vouchers. Simply put, any family up to 100% of the free and reduced lunch line, one proxy for low-income families, can receive 90%, can direct 90% of the public spending in the district in which they live to the school of their choice. And then between 100 and 150% of that line, a family can direct 50%. This is really the first full year. Just short of 10,000 students have taken advantage of this. That's about 1% of the K-12 students in our state. They are, as we had intended and we'd anticipated, 81% are from the lowest income category, 50% are minorities, about 2/3 are urban, the others are rather evenly divided between suburban and rural students. This change brought the predictable reaction, both political and legal. I had one of those, I call them Presbyterian moments the other day. You know, I'm Presbyterian. We're associated with the doctrine, as you may know, of predestination, which theologically, you know, we won't know till we know. But I had a preacher who used to say, a Presbyterian is someone who falls down a flight of stairs and says, well, I'm glad I got that over with. But anyway, here I am with this, you know, rather daunting assignment looming up, and what happens? The plaintiffs who are trying to invalidate this so-called voucher law argued their case in front of the Indiana Supreme Court just 6 days ago. And so I can report to you on this. Now, at the federal level, in a case known as Zellman, the Supreme Court has settled the question that as long as public dollars do not flow directly to an institution, as long as they are at the sole discretion of a family, for instance, that family is free to take them to a religious school without violating the Establishment Clause. And so the plaintiffs in Indiana knew that avenue was closed, but they looked through the Indiana Constitution to see if there was language that would allow them to challenge the law, and they found two. One is our parallel to that, to the federal Constitution, and it prohibits the use of public funds for the benefit of any religious or theological institution. We don't think that this has really much prospect in our Supreme Court. Having watched the argument, I became fortified in that suspicion. First of all, our provision is strictly religiously neutral, doesn't favor in any way any denomination or religious schools versus other non-government schools. And secondly, most critically, the benefit flows to the family and to the student. They decide where it should go. So anyway, that argument was raised. Also, like a lot of other states, certainly in the Northwest Territory, our Constitution has a provision requiring the state to provide, the language says, a uniform system of common schools. But it goes on to say that it is the state's duty to promote moral and intellectual development by, quote, all suitable means. So the argument last Friday was, on behalf of the state, was that the state is not only permitted but encouraged to use supplemental means to further the public education, and that this bill of ours qualifies. Now, I really do believe that it's highly, highly likely that our bill will survive this challenge in court. But I can report to you that those who disapprove of measures like this never, ever, ever give up. And they were successful. We are one of 11 states, only 11 states, that elects as opposed to appoints its superintendent of public instruction. As a matter of good government, this is not a good idea. When I first ran for office, this was one of 70-odd very specific proposals on which we openly campaigned. It was very interesting. And the idea, of course, is that public education is among, if it's not the most important activity of government. It is right there behind public safety. And as a matter of fact, in Indiana, we are number one in America. 55% of the entire state budget is K-12 education. And yet, we have the possibility of complete misalignment of whoever's governor, whoever's in the legislature, and whoever's superintendent of instruction. And that's about to happen because a union leader, she is an elementary school librarian, I think, other than that, is going to be our next superintendent of instruction. It was a highly personal campaign, very effective one, even if not truthful on many occasions. Thousands of parents, for instance, were told at our State Fair Band Day that if this guy Bennett was reelected, fine arts funding would end in Indiana, things like that. But in any event, as a matter of law, I think it will remain on the books, and it'll remain to other players, our legislature, our new governor, the Board of Education, which is appointed by the governor, to see that the laws of the state are given full effect and not subverted. Now, the question that's put to me has to do with what some have called, what the invitation quoted, as saying that choice in education is, some say, the civil rights issue of our day. I think that's a fair observation. Years ago, I was lucky enough to know, in the last years of his life, Dr. Milton Friedman. Dr. Friedman, way, way back, maybe in the 60s, I think, is considered to have first proposed so-called vouchers. And in fact, he and his wife, Rose, although they had been active, of course, on behalf of freedom in all its dimensions, committed their life's earnings and their foundation they created simply to this one goal of trying to promote the idea of choice in education. And but Dr. Friedman's emphasis was always on this as a means of improving the quality of education. In Indiana, we can testify that he's right. Before we passed the 2011 bill, as I mentioned, the we had enabled the families of our state to move across school district lines free of charge. And thousands of them began to do that. Instantly, driving down roads in Indiana, I started encountering billboards advertising purchased by the school corporations saying, you know, check out our test scores. Our graduation rates are higher than the district next door. Direct mail pieces of the kind you might see in either at Christmas time or in a political season were sent out recruiting students, all based on the quality of education. So competition is real, and it springs into being rather quickly when you create the conditions for it. But some of us believe that a choice in education is only partially a matter of quality improvement, that it is first and foremost a matter of social justice, that it is not acceptable that the choice that is available to wealthy families or to either relocate to a school district of higher quality or to pay for their child to go to a school where they feel she'll be safer or better educated or both, that it is not acceptable to, at the same time, tell those who are not sufficiently wealthy that their children have no alternative, and in fact should be incarcerated at a school that, at least in their judgment, isn't serving very well. And because, I mean, it seems to me that years and years that people have been working on this problem, I sometimes worry that folks have become either too discouraged or just desensitized to the way in which lives are blighted by inferior education. The dean is one of the nation's experts in justice for the disabled. Well, you know, we are disabling children every year in too many schools in this country when we send them on to, for instance, later years when they can't even read. In Indiana, you can't leave third grade for fourth grade anymore if you can't read. But in many, many places, this is almost seen to be acceptable. I mean, you know, it's one of those things we should never become desensitized to. My wife and I have 4 daughters, and I sometimes joke that when the first one caught a cold, we rushed her to the emergency room. When the 4th one swallowed a quarter, I took it out of her allowance, you know? But there are things you shouldn't become numb to, and this is certainly one. So when we approach this, if you look at this subject through a social justice lens, it takes you in certain policy directions. One is, when we got the chance to do it, I thought it needed to be universal. It needed to go further. First of all, not a pilot program. The urgency of this situation just doesn't permit years of more experimentation. If it isn't exactly right the first time, it's going to be a whole lot better than the status quo, and we'll fix it in some future iteration. Secondly, that it ought not be limited, as some states have, to so-called failing schools. Now you're in a debate about what's failing and who isn't. And if it is a matter of justice, then it ought to be equally available to everybody. There are still students, no two students are really alike. And so a school that might be adequate for one might not be serving another. And the family ought to be able, regardless of means, some of us believe, to choose otherwise. You know, in arguments like this, it's always important. Sometimes I know I fall short, but it's always important to try to empathize, try to listen and understand the arguments of those who disagree. And for many, many years I have. But it is hard in this case, I have to tell you, because in view of the facts, the grim facts, first of all, to oppose measures like this, it's hard not to find selfish and heartless, and hard to see that the welfare of children is really primary in the motivations of those who still seek to to stop programs like this or to exterminate those who promote them. There's a very, very healthy climate change, however, that's gone on recently, and surely you've noticed it. The support for reforms of the kinds I mentioned has grown and spread across the spectrum. The people who made the movie Waiting for Superman come from a very different set of opinions on most subjects than maybe I would, or perhaps some of you would. There are so many good-hearted people whom I differ on other issues who have come together around the kind of changes that we have enacted in Indiana that I have really high hopes that this time the forces of reaction will not roll things back. But there's no guarantee. As a friend of mine points out, Zellman was decided 5-4. It would only take one change to reverse all that and to throw children from low-income families back into the schools that the government monopoly tells them they have to go to. Let me conclude and go to your questions with, if I may, just a little more general observation. And that is that to address effectively the problems this country has, I think will require the restoration of trust and two-way trust in a system that is, in which it is, I think, faded and dwindled to a dangerous extent. In our service, which is within a month of ending now in Indiana, we have worked very, very hard on this. Whether it was ethics reforms, which we did right out of the box, transparency of information, visibility to the citizen about what's going on in their government, where dollars are being spent, who's getting contracts, all that sort of thing. Effectiveness. We've worked relentlessly to try to see that, and we may believe that government should be limited, but inside that sphere of legitimate government activities, we believe there's a really solemn duty to deliver them as well as possible. If you go to a Bureau of Motor Vehicles license branch in Indiana this month, you will be out in 9 minutes and 14 seconds on average, as one example. And always to try to make certain that our actions are reconciled with our words. Why do I think this is so important? I have said to people of generally similar viewpoints generally similar to mine that skepticism about big government is as American as Little League baseball. But we should not let, and we should certainly not encourage, skepticism about big government to become contempt for all government. There are things we must do together, and we must do them effectively. And we've got some issues facing us right now as a nation that are as daunting and as deadly and as menacing, I believe, as anything except maybe the Soviet nuclear threat of the second half of the last century. And so, whatever one's viewpoint, any contribution to restoring some degree of confidence in government is a useful contribution right now. But I would end by pointing out that reciprocally, I believe it's essential for government to reaffirm its trust in the people whom it serves. And in every way to indicate, I sometimes say that we view Americans as creatures of dignity, not objects of therapy. Not as people who are, first of all, entitled, and secondly, fully capable of making decisions for themselves. They do not need their benevolent betters, even the graduates of great universities like this one, to make these choices for them. And in fact, it demeans and diminishes their personhood and their dignity when we act as though they are helpless and hapless and really have to have these calls made for them. So in our limited scale, I think we have some evidence for this. The health insurance plan that Leon mentioned is a personal health account for our lowest income people. The money's theirs. They manage it. They decide. Guess what? They prove to be great consumers. They get second opinions more often. They go to the emergency room less often. They get generic drugs more often. And then the voucher program that I've been describing, which says at its essence, we trust you. You are a person of dignity. You are fully capable. And if we're going to be a functioning free society, in fact, we have to have people make their own decisions. Will they make their own mistakes? Sure. Don't you? But collectively, we'll be a stronger country. We'll be a freer country. We'll be a more just country if we approach our public decision-making that way. So I'll just say on behalf of the folks that I work with in Indiana, empirically, don't tell us low-income people can't decide wisely about their schools or their health care or anything else. And as a matter of, I think, a proper reading of the foundations of our democracy, don't tell us that they shouldn't have that option. Thank you very much. Is this me?
It's you. Well, I just want to say we are so honored to have you here. This is one of the great public servants of the United States, so let's just applaud. And it's actually in that spirit that I want to start. How did you get this law passed?
Well, the planets aligned. We had a very successful election. We had a divided legislature. And our loyal opposition in Indiana is tightly, welded to the teachers union and to the sort of education establishment. By the way, a learning point for me years ago is, yes, the union is, without question, the strongest and best financed interest group resisting change, but it's hardly just them. They have allies that folks who are just deeply invested in the bureaucracies of public education. So anyway, for the years in which the other side had control of at least half our legislature, there was no speech I could give, there was no study we could commission, there was no public grassroots organization we could mobilize that would move them 1 inch. But when, in the wake of 2010, when we found ourselves with majorities in both houses, and I'd like to think we had prepared the way intellectually. We didn't have to start the argument then. And the other thing, I was speaking on this in Washington yesterday, people very interested in this very subject, and they asked me about the way we did it, and I said, well, it's like the T-shirt I see at the gym, go big or go home. And we had the opportunity, so we sort of ran the table while we did.
Did you have to compromise anything that you wanted?
Yeah, sure. I probably would have raised the income thresholds a little further. Inevitably you do. I always approached. We made a lot of big changes the last few years in our state, in a state that has not previously been known for them. And generally the way I found that works best and respects the proper prerogative of the legislature, for instance, is to try to set boundary conditions and then be prepared to accept all kinds of changes inside them.
As the law is implemented, particularly the voucher aspect, I know one transition problem is that some people whose kids have been going to private school have now moved to public school so that they can then be eligible for the vouchers. Yeah. But I assume that's just a transition problem.
Yeah, this is a great example of one of the adjustments or maybe compromises that we made. And I was very comfortable with this one. Yeah, you're quite right. The law says that to qualify, you have to have spent at least 1 full year in a public school. So we said to the public schools, you get first shot. If you do a good job, they're not going to want to leave. But if they come to your school for a year and the family decides that it's not best for their child, then we shouldn't incarcerate them there. So yeah, but that's a great example of one of the adjustments that helped us get it through.
Do you think it would be advisable or desirable to lift the income cap altogether?
Well, here you run into fiscal questions. Although actually, of course, since you're only spending 50% for 4/5 of these kids and 90% for the I'm sorry, 90% for 4/5 of the kids and 50% for the remainder, it actually costs the state less money. But I thought that we got the limits. I would have liked them a little higher. But what we're looking at is what's the average tuition, and I simply wanted to make sure it was high enough that families above the line could probably manage it on their own. Mm-hmm. And I think we got pretty close to that. It's not that expensive in most cases. The elementary and middle schools typically are so much less expensive than the public schools, and usually they're only charging $3,000 or $4,000, which is what this thing permits.
Now, one of the reasons for that, particularly the religious schools, is that there's a subsidy from the religious community, and there's a question whether that's going to be sustainable over time, and particularly if the enrollments rise.
Yeah, well, those subsidies are shrinking very, very fast. A lot of those schools had gone out of existence, and so I don't know the extent to which, for instance, the two systems that we have in any size in Indiana are Catholic parochial schools and Lutheran, and there have been fewer of both in recent years. So I mean, neither denomination has been able to maintain its support the way they once did.
How have you seen the state address the needs of the least informed parents who are eligible for vouchers? Because the market idea, and you know, your very wonderful statement at the end about people can make good decisions, but we know there's some people who are not well informed, and
yeah. Well, there certainly has been an office. I don't know about the starting next year, but there has been an office in our Department of Education that worked hard on that. But I'll tell you, don't underestimate, first of all, the interest of parents. I mean, I've met thousands of them by now, and you go to these schools and you'll find Hispanic parents whose English is very faltering. I had more conversations in Spanish than in English with some of these parents, but they knew, they heard somewhere that there was a chance for their son or daughter to go to that school down the block, not the one that they felt so trapped by. Yeah.
Do you have any people object that the voucher initiative can hollow out common schooling? So there's the legal argument that you identified about the state's constitution commitment to common education, but there's also a policy dimension to this about producing the common school, the common experience. You know, if only 1% are going, you don't worry about it so much, but if there is an idea of integrating kids from different backgrounds, and that goes by the wayside because people are sending their kids to schools that are very different, either by religion or even by mission. Do you worry about that? Do you hear that as an objection? You
hear the objection. You also hear this a lot about charter schools. Yes. You know, they're going to cream the best students. It works the other way around. Our charter schools and our voucher schools are serving lower income kids. They're more integrated than the public schools near them in almost every case. So I don't think empirically that these criticisms have been borne out. And but you know, even if at some point it appeared they were, I'd be back to the question: whose choice should it be? Who ought to have this? Who ought to have the authority here? And hard for me to think that any other criterion should override it.
Do you think that there are any kinds of schools that should not be eligible for these vouchers?
Very good question. You know, we wrestled a lot with this. I mean, first of all, I didn't mention, but to qualify for the voucher program, you have to meet the same standards as the public schools, academic standards, and we've raised those. And so there are some schools that, you know, and they have to give the test. They have to give the same test that our students are taking elsewhere. So academic quality would be one way. And then, you know, there were criticisms, for instance, from the right that, you know, you'll have madrasas.
Right.
What are you going to do about those? Well, we don't have any so far. So it hasn't been a problem. I mean, if it were to grow, if the universe of non-government schools were to grow and start to include some that taught, I don't know, anti-democratic
Intolerance.
doctrine or something, or intolerance, that'd be an issue to deal with then, but not a problem now. And I certainly didn't think that the hypothetical risk should stand in the way of something that might start saving thousands of kids right away.
Another kind of worry that people have is that vouchers or even charter schools could be organized around themes like an Afrocentric school or a school that is divisive in some way. You haven't encountered that, so you're not worried about it. But the government does have to be involved in deciding which schools are eligible, one way or the other.
Yeah, we wrestled with it a lot, but again, our law at the moment takes a pretty neutral stance apart from academic quality. There are some schools which are, and by the way, a couple of the finest charter schools in our state. One of them, where I was again just a week ago, is achieving almost 100% college admission in one of the poorest parts of Indianapolis, and they have just opened an all-female and an all-male academy side by side because they believe that it's conducive to high achievement on the part of their students. Well, we wouldn't get in their way. Let's see what they can do.
So here's a hypothetical. I'm sorry, I am a law professor, but the one thing that the federal Constitution is very clear about in the choice area is that there has to be a right by parents to choose a private school. That means that we are currently creating all over the country two school systems, public and private. Because one, the private school is guaranteed as a constitutionally protected choice. And the public school, every state has a state constitution that guarantees that there will be provision of public schooling. What about eliminating public schooling? What about having only private schools? Well, and you use vouchers, but allow the parents to pick only from private schools.
No, I think that both as a matter of reality and quite properly, I think it is a responsibility of government to ensure, state government, local government, to ensure that quality education is available. And as free market as my instincts were, I wouldn't leave it to chance that the market called into existence the right kind of schools without that structure in place. I mean, I've always said, I never tried hard not to overclaim for this particular provision of our reform package. I said I didn't expect it to explode into a huge phenomenon. The legislature, this was another compromise, our opposition wanted a lid, at least for the first couple years, on how many students could be in the program. So they chose 15,000 for this year. We didn't get there. We only got 2/3 of the way there. Now, my response to that is that's fine. I've said over and over, if the public schools of Indiana became so good that nobody wanted a voucher, that would be just fine with me. That's what we're after. And just to finish first of all, when those of you who wind up in business will quickly see the extent to which life is settled at the margins. Now, 1% of our students isn't very many, but it's having a highly leveraged effect, I believe, on other schools who would like to successfully match what's being done so kids don't leave. And secondly, even if it's just 10,000 students today, it may make a life or death difference for them. That's enough for me.
If the cap is reached, do you think that the legislature should lift it?
Well, the cap goes away after this year. So, but my guess is, well, we'll have to see. We need at least one more year to know what sort of growth trajectory we have, because the law took effect just really a month and a half before last school year. So we don't really know what the demand was, and about 3,500 students. It was still the biggest first-year program in any state, anywhere. This was the first year, back to your question about public information, so we're the first year where there was a reasonably good chance that most parents knew there was such a thing. And we went to 10,000. So I don't know if it'll flatten out or keep on that growth track, but in any event, as far as I can tell, it'll still be at the margins in a state with a little over 1 million school kids.
Well, you've sort of answered this, but I'll ask it anyway. What would be the measures of success of this initiative? Is it success measured by test scores, by numbers going to college, graduation rates? Is it success by the impact on the public school system? What's success? I
think those are all important measures. I would hope to see improvement in all of those. You know, causality will always be hard to tease out. Again, I concentrated on the choice program here because that was the nature of the invitation, but we always stressed that this bundle of reforms we thought were cohesive and self-reinforcing, and you couldn't really pull them apart. So we're seeing big progress in Indiana in just the last 3 or 4 years, but it'll be for scholars at Harvard or somewhere else maybe in a few more years to go back and try to determine what led to what.
Well, I'll say 1 or 2 things about the pending case and be interested in your comments. You know, the state constitution is one of many that have language that's more explicit than the federal constitution on the restriction of public dollars going to benefit a religious organization, which is, again, not the language in the federal constitution. And so while we have the Zellman decision interpreting the federal constitution, there's a potential tension between the state constitutional interpretation and federal constitutional interpretation. And one danger that may happen, I don't know if this will happen in Indiana, is that some states may say our language in our constitution is more restrictive than the federal, and it does not save a voucher plan to say that there's the intervention of a parental choice.
Yeah, it happened in Florida.
Exactly.
And I didn't mention, but there is one fairly recent case in Indiana called Embry versus O'Bannon. O'Bannon was my predecessor 2 removed, in which our Supreme Court upheld a practice in which public school teachers go to private schools and sometimes take computers with them and teach a course or 2 or 3, some special education and things like that. And this was held to be not only an incidental benefit to the private school, but a large benefit to the student. So in arguing the case last Friday, our solicitor certainly made reference to that. It's another reason we think that our bill has a strong basis. By the way, I should say, I said I'm impersonating a lawyer, but I'm not oblivious to these things. When we saw the results of the 2010 election, and we counted heads and said, you know, we have a chance. We really have a chance to break through. And I said, it's got to have not only a voucher program, but a universal one for all the reasons we talked about. The very first thing I did was commission 2 legal looks separately. I called the best lawyer I know in America. He's argued a couple of these cases at the highest levels, and asked him and a colleague to look at the Indiana Constitution as well as rehash the federal state of play. And then we had another one done. I think before we were done, there were 3 independently, because I said, I'm not going to go through this and walk all over the coals that it's going to take to do it, only to find out that the way we drafted it opened us up to some, you know, getting called out on a technicality. So there was nothing in the argument last Friday that wasn't fully anticipated and thought through in the East Side. I doesn't say we couldn't be wrong, but we were as careful as we could be, knowing that people would look for a legal imperfection.
Well, one thing that may happen, again, I'm not sure in Indiana, but in some states where the state constitution is so rigid that there can be no benefit from public dollars to a religious organization, it may actually lead to a supremacy clause issue, because it may be that those state constitutional provisions are unconstitutional under the federal constitution.
That's interesting.
So I'm going to want to open it up to everyone here. I guess I had just one more question, which is Milton Friedman was asked if there was a reason that his first paper advocating school vouchers was published in 1955, which happened to be coinciding with Brown versus Board of Education. And so he wrote quite a thoughtful comments saying, no, that had no motivation. This is not trying to help people avoid school desegregation. But this, of course, has tarred the whole voucher movement ever since. The timing and also the rise of the private academies in the South. And so I wonder if that's been an issue at all in some of the politics or even legal challenges that you can anticipate if it produced a situation, which I know it has not in Indiana, that there was racial separation as a result of vouchers. Do you think that that should be a legal problem or a political problem?
Well, it'd be disappointing, and again, it'd be a reversal of the pattern as it started, but I don't know what the future holds. It wouldn't change my view that this is a matter of individual rights and justice, and also that it is highly conducive to a better educational outcome for all through the competition that it gives rise to. But once again, just over half of all the participants in Indiana are minorities now, and we are a state in which black plus Hispanic and all minorities is low double digits. So it's heavily, very heavily disproportionate right now in providing aid to minority families, and that's just fine.
Well, in fact, you know, I think contrary to what some of the critics had anticipated, some of the biggest support for school vouchers in the country is from communities of color, so minority families, because they are looking for a way to improve their educational opportunities.
Yeah, many are, and you know, I talked about the change that we've seen in the intellectual outlook here. I don't think you'd mind my saying that when our reformist superintendent got beat 2 weeks ago, one of the first calls I got was from President Obama's Secretary of Education saying, "What's this mean?" He was very upset. Now, they don't go as far, the one step they will not take, and some others from their side of the tracks have yet to take, some have, some haven't, is the step to private choice.
Right.
But the rest of our agenda, they're all in for.
Totally for.
And more power to them. That's exactly the kind of bipartisan support that will be necessary, because the forces of reaction will never give up.
Very, very powerful. Let's open it up. Comments, questions? Do you want to recognize people?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Mitch Daniels, thank you so much for coming. For much of the 20th century, the United States had the best public education system in the world. Now, despite spending what I believe is more per capita on public education than any other country in the world, we're ranked in the 20s and 30s in terms of educational outcomes among developed nations. So my question is, what factors do you think contributed to the decline in American education, and what do you think reform might look like at the federal level?
Well, again, I don't want to hang the entire blame for where we are on unionization, but this has clearly been a factor. When the upper hand was gained by people whose job, I'm not faulting them for doing their job, is to promote the interests of teachers, and particularly to protect teachers. The protection of poor teaching is the single biggest factor. You know, teacher quality was the first part of our reform package. Why? When you're done regressing all the data and whatever else education lacks for in this country is not lack of information, by a huge factor, 18 to 1, somebody calculated, the variable that's the most important is teacher quality, and it has declined, there's no question. I'm about to take up a new job in higher education. What a thought. And the School of Education at the fine university that I'll be heading has the second lowest SAT scores in the whole place, and that's upside down. So that's I think where it started, and let's give the rest of the world credit. They invested and have high standards and caught up.
You know, your point is so well taken, because the emphasis on some school reforms on class size has so so upside down, because you can have bad teachers and small classes, and that's not a good investment.
Yeah, I confess to having been, in fact, I've been a big booster. I mean, I've made a huge point without much success of trying to move dollars. Only 61 cents the Indiana school dollar gets to the classroom. The rest is in support, administrative staff, and all this sort of thing. And I keep pointing out that if you could just move that needle 1 or 2 or 3%, it's more money than we dream of finding, you know, organically in the next budget. And I confess that having talked about, you know, smaller classes through lower overhead, but you're completely right. The data is inarguable. A great teacher in front of 35 students will get better results than a lousy teacher in front of 15.
I have a question specifically on special education.
Yeah.
Do you view, especially since there are a lot of, I know right now, private schools that are designed to deal with children with learning differences and do really well.
Yeah.
And there's some school districts already where you can get letters that if you need special education, you go to those schools. Do you see the system you've implemented in the end is helping special education?
Yeah, I think maybe so. And some of the charter schools that have come up most recently specialize in this area, and with parent success. It's early days, but it looks good. You know, it's very interesting you'd ask this question, because one justice, there are 5 justices on the Indiana Supreme Court, and one justice, African American, appointed by a Democratic predecessor. And you know, if I lined them up and had to guess, not that I'm any good at this, but if I had to guess how they'd vote, he might be the most iffy. But he bored in on this very point, and he asked the plaintiff's attorney, well, what about a special ed kid? Are you going to tell them they have to go to the public school that the district tells them to? What, if there's perhaps a school that has particular competency in this? You know, everybody perked up when he asked that question. Oh, you know, maybe Justice Rucker is going to come out in a different place. Yeah.
What role has the Federal Department of Education had on Indiana's school reform consideration document?
We've had a very cooperative relationship. They gave us a waiver to, for instance, we believe in measuring growth. We also have, we think, they have the best system in the country for measuring the growth of students. That's the fairest way, by the way. You know, I agree with teacher unions and others that it's not fair. The teacher can't control what comes in the classroom. So just looking at absolute scores at the end of the year on test scores could really work some unfairnesses. And so they gave us a waiver from No Child Left Behind to move to the so-called growth model. It's been a pretty cooperative relationship, and I guess that'll continue, but it'll be a little ironic because their biggest differences in Indiana now will not be with the Republican administration, they'll be with the Democratic superintendent.
Hi, I want to kind of build on what you've been talking about so far. One thing, my mom was part of the Chicago teachers union strike and all that, and I think one of her biggest issues was that they were encouraging teacher quality to be judged based on, you know, student growth or student performance, but not necessarily taking into account that teachers have no control over what happens to students outside of the classroom, and not, you know, adding more dollars into the budget for wraparound services or anything like that, which I'm not sure what the need is for any, if there's a need for that in Indiana, but have you taken into consideration the need for wraparound services in your school reform and education reform?
Well, yes, we have, and you know, we just made full-day kindergarten universal in the state, even at tough economic times, and I hope that the state will be able to go further starting next year. Special, at least on a limited basis, preschool for those who might otherwise struggle when they get there. But, you know, true as it is, it just cannot serve as an all-purpose excuse for persistent failure. And the proof is that there are schools that are succeeding very, very well with the very same problems. I mean, with children with the very same problems. So it cannot be that we excuse those completely, excuse those who aren't getting the job done. How about way in the back there?
Thanks. So one of the big consumers of private education is religious people, obviously. And your bill sort of, by requiring 1 year in the public school, kind of locks us out of it. How do you feel about that?
That's kind of what?
By requiring 1 year in the public school, which many religious people who go to private school are not going to be willing to do.
Yeah.
We're sort of locked out of that system. How do you feel about that?
Well, I hope it won't happen very often. There are other pathways. We have a very vigorous, for instance, scholarship program. You can get a tax credit for contributing to funds. I was doing this for years before we made our breakthrough, providing scholarships to low-income families. And those who are already involved in that way can move straight into the voucher program as the kid gets, let's say, to first grade. But no, in a perfect world, maybe you wouldn't do it that way, but it was one of those refinements that helped us get the bill through. You know, the other thing to say is that a very significant percentage, every time I check one, it's in the neighborhood at least of a quarter to a third of the students attending religious schools are not of that faith. A very significant percentage of the students in Catholic schools in our state are not Catholic. Lutheran schools are not Lutheran. So, you know, for many, many families, they're simply pursuing schools where they believe there'll be safety and order and caring and high standards and caring, supportive teaching.
You know, Governor, we are thrilled that you are joining higher education. I'm not sure which is a better title, Governor or President, but we do hope that you'll continue to play a role in politics, including national politics. It's just been an honor to have you here.
Thanks for having me.